Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Yay, somebody called my name. Hi, Lisa, how are you? Thank you. I'm a first timer on doing a welcome for a conference, so excuse me if I'm a little geeked out. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Pamela Phillips. I am the Senior Assistant, Program Assistant for the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And I'd like to welcome you to the 48th Annual Scholar and Feminist Conference, Housing Justice, Housing Futures. Yay. This conference is the culmination of many different strands of works, conversation, and collaboration over many years. We've been working with various individuals and community organizations over the past few years and thought that we could use this conference as a reflection point to reconnect with past collaborators and bring in others whose work, as you will learn, has done so much to advance housing justice. We are grateful that you all have come here today to continue these conversations with us. We're certain it will be an exciting, informative, and future-oriented day. Thank you, Janet. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event. I'd like to first send a very special thank you to Miriam Neptune, our Senior Associate Director, for everything that's going on today. And Sophie Kreitzberg, BCRW's Post-Bac Fellow, for all the amazing organizing and logistical support that they provided for this conference. I am truly grateful to you both. I'd like to thank our co-directors, Janet Jacobson, Janet has been supporting this conversation from the very beginning, and who, without a strong nudge and a lot of encouragement, we would not be having this conversation today. And Pamela Madison, who sadly could not be here, she's recuperating at home, for her connections and contributions. Our creative director, Hope Dector, Program and Communications Director, Avi Cummings, and our amazing team of student research assistants, as well as former directors, Tina Camp and Elizabeth Castelli, for keeping this work moving forward as we went through the directorships. I'd also like to thank our campus partners, events management, facilities, community safety, IMATS, AV, Chartwells, or whoever did the catering today, I don't remember. Home Sweet Harlem. Okay, sorry, I'm just so used to inserting Chartwells because it's an on-campus thing. And all the labor, seen and unseen, that went into making sure this conference is successful. Yay! And last but not least, the planning committee, who was so generous with their time, ideas, and invaluable input. And a special thanks to Mary Rocco and Akira Drake Rodriguez and April DeSimone. And now I'm going to turn things over to Miriam to start us off. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to add to our list of thank yous, Bodies in Motion, the ASL interpretation team that will be with us throughout the day. And before we officially begin the program, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which this campus was built is part of Lenape-Hoking, the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people, the Delaware Nation. The Lenape were displaced from their homelands to places as far as Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. We pay respect to the Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, and uplift their continuing presence on their homelands. We also acknowledge the legacy of forced displacement, enslavement, and genocide of Indigenous African people from our homelands. We understand that our existence on this campus, using the resources of this institution, has been enabled by a history of both land and labor extraction. Now I want to thank everyone, all of you, who have traveled today to be here for this incredible program. I promise that it will live up to your expectations. You can see me after if it didn't. Our goal today is to uplift the idea of housing as a right that we are all entitled to, without exception. Today, we are joined by a number of scholars, activists, artists, and organizers who have been fighting and resisting the ongoing exploitation and extraction of land, resources, shelter, and wealth from our communities. Let's give the organizers a round of applause. So, the themes of this conference are very personal. Pam and I have had many conversations about being Black mothers in this often brutal city, raising Black children, and the truth, right? The truth that we must always live wondering what new violence has been designed for us. Or painfully aware that our family's well-being depends on our gainful employment, which depends on our health. As a single Black parent with multiple advanced degrees and a wonderful job at Barnard College, I have experienced the panic of applying to rent an apartment for myself and my kids, but still being told I don't qualify for unspecified reasons, repeatedly. Like most working people in this country, I have lived most of my life 1 or 2 paychecks away from crisis. I have watched rents go up and I've had to give up basic necessities in order to make ends meet. And that is with so much privilege. Those of us who have lived through or know people who have lived through eviction, foreclosure, and other forms of dispossession know the enduring effects these experiences have on our minds, our bodies, our ability to thrive. We understand that globalized private interests are accumulating property at incredible rates, turning renters into revenue generators, furthering racialized violence and violence against Black, Latinx, immigrant, disabled, Indigenous, and queer and trans homes. But today, we are here to uplift and be inspired by the people who are persisting in opposition to this violence and engaged in the work of changing the relations and the assumptions that define housing as we know it. We have invited an incredible line of speakers and workshop facilitators to share from their research and their work, and to hopefully make connections that help us construct and keep moving forward toward visions of just housing, and the power in the statement that housing is, in fact, a human right. While we celebrate, we are also painfully aware that there are many voices who cannot be here today to be heard, namely those of the people we have lost to the COVID-19 pandemic, which many of us understood was not just a health issue, but a housing issue. It was and continues to be an issue of inequality and of state violence. We want to remember all those who were lost and whose lives have been deeply impacted by the ongoing pandemic. In particular, today we remember housing scholar, activist, journalist, and Barnard professor Tom Waters, who was a friend and a mentor to many in this room. I thank Oksana Mironova for these words, which are also posted on the website for City Limits, where you can read more about Tom's work and from his work. Tom Waters was best known as a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society, a job at which he excelled and a perch from which he served as an invaluable resource to the New York City housing movement. He was also a long-serving board member of Tenants and Neighbors, a PhD candidate in political science at the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and a loving partner to Hillary Callahan, and father to Daniel Wadahan. Tom Waters' work spanned the trajectory of the city's housing landscape over the past 20 years. His research and writing both described and shaped organizing and policy in New York City and beyond. Here are some highlights. Rent regulation. Throughout his career, Tom documented the havoc that rent law retrenchment wreaked on New York's housing affordability, and the need for legislative action to expand the program to cover more geographies and building typologies. His research was crucial in both justifying the need for and crafting the possible parameters of the historic 2019 rent stabilization and rent control reforms. Neighborhood change. Tom's research, both at the Community Service Society and his scholarly work, focused on arriving at a more nuanced understanding of the forces that drive neighborhood change. He sought to link his quantitative research of rising rents in gentrifying neighborhoods to the struggle for stronger rent regulation and better land use policy. Homelessness. Over the past few years, Tom worked closely with the state's homelessness advocacy groups, to make a case for policy mechanisms that would permanently house unsheltered New Yorkers. In particular, Tom focused on advocacy for a state rental assistance program, which would create a permanent funding stream for the operations of housing affordable to extremely low-income households. Housing futures. Tom envisioned a more equitable housing future for New York, with a significantly expanded decommodified housing sector. In 2015, he advocated for a revived Mitchell-Lama program, which would provide benefits to households with a wide range of incomes. In 2020, he wrote about the existing social housing landscape in New York and the possibility for its expansion statewide and beyond. Ideally, the model would incorporate three main goals: insulating housing from market forces, promoting social equality, and enabling residents to exercise democratic control over their housing. Today, we want to acknowledge Tom's partner, beloved Barnard Professor of Biology, Hillary Callahan, who is sitting with us here, and thank her for sharing a little of Tom's legacy with us by bringing in books from Tom's collection that will be available for you to take home. They are on display in the lobby on a book cart. Thank you, Hillary. And as you leave today for the lunch, you can take some time, if you'd like, to leave a remembrance about Tom on the whiteboard that is here on the north side of the room. Okay. We are now going to transition to our opening plenary, Dreaming of Housing Justice, which features a lineup of organizers, activists, and scholars from all over this country. What a privilege to have these powerful visionaries here together in conversation. I want to welcome my moderator, Mary Rocco, Urban Studies Professor and Director of Community Engaged Scholarship.
Good morning. Thank you, Miriam, for kicking us off with such an inspirational remembrance of Tom and acknowledgement of many of the issues that we are here today to discuss. I'm thrilled to be moderating this phenomenal panel of researchers, organizers, practitioners, and scholars. Rather than read their official bios, which you can find online at the conference website, I'd like to use this as an opportunity to frame what this panel can bring, where we're going to aim to explore visionary models of housing that foster support, the continuation of cultural heritage, intergenerational relationships, and shared resources. Our goal today is to highlight the work of those who study, promote, build, innovate, and dream of sustainable, equitable forms of housing for all people. Our panelists here today do that in different ways. So let me tell you about them and their work. And I'll ask the panelists to come forward as I introduce you, because we did not, and I apologize, we did not choreograph the entry. So, as a housing policy analyst at Community Service Society here in New York, Oksana Mironova researches and advocates for housing policies that benefit New Yorkers. She works with grassroots organizations and highlights strategies for tenant organizing and movements towards housing justice that include identifying tangible problems and results at the level of building conditions and rental rates. Her focus is also on building a shared consciousness among tenants that aggregates individual power into collective action and explores structural roots of housing injustice. Akira, and we'll hold your applause to the end, please, because there's a lot of panelists. Akira Drake Rodriguez is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. Her work underscores the radical potential of public housing through tenant activism in Atlanta and focuses on the importance of housing activism to Black liberation and broader racial and economic justice movements. She examines the ways in which cities are intentionally designed to achieve political ends and express racist and classist agendas. Yet she also reveals the radical potential of the built environment and how grassroots power convenes in place to resist systems of oppression. Welcome, Akira. Lisa Yoon Lee is a cultural activist, the executive director of the National Public Housing Museum, and an associate professor in art history and gender and women's studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Lee's work with the National Public Housing Museum demonstrates the importance of public consciousness raising and memory making about the systemic and historical power imbalances at work in radical and economic segregation through housing. Lee's scholarship on the preservation of public housing contributes to a narrative that understands housing justice through reinvigorating historic sites and civil society and corrects maligned narratives about public housing. Jackie Paul Sims is a community organizer and the executive director of the People's Alliance for Transit Housing and Empowerment, a nonprofit agency that advocates for public policy change in support of safe and affordable housing and provides education, legal, and financial assistance to residents facing housing insecurity, eviction, and displacement in Nashville. As the director of PATH, Jackie advocated for housing justice at the neighborhood scale in East Nashville through a redevelopment campaign that prioritizes Black residents who live in affordable housing and are under threat of displacement. She is also able to leverage her organizing power as a board member of the Affordable Housing Resources, Inc., an organization that creates affordable housing and strengthens neighborhoods in Middle Tennessee. Tela Troge works at the intersection of activism and legal frameworks that can inform housing justice movements. As a New York attorney at law in the office of Tela Troge, PLLC, her campaigns with the Shinnecock Nation address the urgency of climate change and particular vulnerability of Indigenous communities on the South Shore of Long Island. Not only is the ancestral territory in a precarious geographic position and subject to erosion, saltwater intrusion, and degradation of aquaculture, but the political system against which the Shinnecock struggle has meant that protective Indigenous practices, such as kelp farming, are hard to achieve as a norm in New York State's legal frameworks. In addition to establishing a stewardship practice that doubles as a business using traditional Shinnecock sugar kelp management strategies, Troge and other members of the Shinnecock Nation, as warriors of the Sunrise Movement, embarked on a campaign for sovereignty and economic justice in 2019. The campaign was sparked by a lawsuit filed by the state of New York challenging Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination of Shinnecock territory in Southampton, and drew renewed attention to the wealth disparities between the Shinnecock residents in the otherwise wealthy town. Elora Lee Raymond is an urban planner and assistant professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Raymond has written extensively on the links between financialized housing, rising eviction rates, neighborhood instability, rental prices, deferred maintenance. Her work reveals how racism is encoded into the hierarchies of housing finance technologies that shape legal frameworks and allow LLCs and other private entities to obscure the power systems and people behind housing transactions and what often results in housing instability and injustices for renters. She draws attention to the legal frameworks that protect LLCs over people who live in homes that are being sold and purchased, including the lack of transparency that makes municipal investigations and enforcement into the resulting poor housing conditions very difficult. She has worked in housing-related issues that affect Pacific Islander communities in LA and Indigenous land in Samoa. Some of the themes that emerge from this esteemed body of work, we can see the persistent links between systemic oppression, place, housing, race, and economics, as well as the opportunities for transformation and liberation embedded within justice-oriented approaches to the future. Ongoing privatization struggles through financialization practices and the privatization of public housing continue to chip away at the activist strongholds, many of which originated in public housing and other justice movements, and make organizing targets harder to pin down. Grassroots power and bottom-up collaboration yields a better outcome for people who are oppressed and everyone else. The success of tenant organizing will rest on its applications across multiple geographies, scales, and populations. I'm certain that the conversation started on this panel and throughout the day will reveal other themes and points of departure for the future of housing justice across several sectors, and I'm interested to hear what you all bring to the table. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Okay, so we're going to jump right in. Is this working? Yeah, okay. My first question, and I invite you all to spend a little time answering it, is work with the street campaigns and place-based organizations or attention campaigns has yielded transformative outcomes and bolstered the housing justice movement. What are the necessary steps that must be taken to expand activist and organizing work to improve housing futures across the board? What are the effective strategies to grow power from the ground up, as well as to leverage it laterally to support adjacent justice claims? It's two questions in one, I understand. Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Thank you.
As I spent a lot of time in Nashville working adjacent to a lot of our grassroots community organizing entities. And one of the first things that I see needs to take place is for a lot of those organizations to reevaluate what their agendas are. The agendas must be centered in or on the impacted people. And I saw a lot that did not reflect that. I saw a great deal of antagonism take place between the various organizations because the agendas were not the impacted persons that we all should have been working in behalf of. So that's something that really has to, some real honest conversations have to be held around that. They did not take place in the city where I'm living, Nashville. And the second question.
What effective strategies to grow power from the ground up as well as leverage it?
All righty. Equally as important, we must find as many ways as possible to include impacted persons, to educate them, to help them understand how valuable their voices are, and they need to have a seat at the table. It is not in their best interest to just have people in patriarchal positions advocating on their behalf. They need to be at the table. Their voices need to be heard. They need to be included in discussions, going to council meetings, zoning meetings, what have you, so that they can feel more empowered and that they can begin to participate in changes that need to take place from the ground up.
Thank you.
I'm happy to go. Do you have to do anything here? No, we're just turning it on. Okay, great. All right, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, not only as my role as the executive director of the National Public Housing Museum, but also as a proud Barnard mom. Josie is a senior graduating from Gender and Women's Studies here, so anyways, it's really nice to be here. Yeah, we should clap for that, yeah. Even though I'm not going to call her out, but I think she was sleeping this morning and said, is it okay if I come later? Anyway, the museum that I am the director of was started by public housing residents in 2000 as a result of the Plan for Transformation, an urban renewal project that was an ambitious project to present a new plan for public housing, which is kind of the blueprint for like Chicago's blueprint also. And that plan left a massive wake in not only the city of Chicago, but like urban renewal plans, harken back to, Baldwin's phrase, urban renewal as Negro removal. It's had massive displacement ramifications. And the first thing that plan did was to bulldoze 11 housing projects that at that time represented the largest net loss of affordable housing in the entire United States. And when you kind of say their names right, it's Jane Addams Homes, Harold Ickes Homes, Robert Taylor Homes, Cabrini Green. These names conjure feelings and emotions in the popular imagination. And normally, it's not sort of thoughts about the deep networks of people who supported one another, the incredibly imaginative businesses like Candy Ladies or barber shops, or of sort of tenant organizing and radical reimagining of what it meant to be supportive of one another and empower people. It's usually stereotypes of what it means to be poor and Black in America, which is the result of a deeply racialized history that we have. And it's one that doesn't have a systemic analysis of police acting with impunity and sort of surveillance. It doesn't talk about deferred maintenance and crumbling buildings. And it doesn't talk about the way that people have been stereotyped and sort of disenfranchised from all sorts of public sectors because of this one stereotype. Now, we know that from people like Akira's beautiful book and Rhonda Williams' book, that there's so many other stories of public housing that we need to learn from. And we also know that it's not just the scholars, but like Jackie said, if we listen to the residents of public housing, there is so much to learn. And so for us at the National Public Housing Museum, the first thing that we did was start an oral history archive of public housing stories using methodologies like oral history to capture the experiences of public housing residents, of people who normally were also left out of mainstream narratives because of the way that archives have been racist and sexist and also left huge absences in the public record of these stories. And so from these stories, we started building what I think is a kind of, very responsive programs, like listening to the stories of Candy Ladies and other cooperatives that existed in public housing places. We have a museum store, which is a cooperative, which is learning from this history and building a solidarity economy. Listening to people's stories, we realized we actually need to figure out a way of building reparations frameworks for the history of unjust displacement practices, of redlining and other large-scale national public policies. And we have a kind of theory of change which is built around storytelling and listening to residents, linking this idea of the giving of accounts with moral responsibility and accountability of all of us, and then kind of fiscal accountability, which is reparations and sort of funding projects that actually really address housing as a human right. So I can say more later about all these different programs, but I think that's really the key way that the museum, founded by public housing residents, is trying to do this work, yeah. And one more thing I'll just say, in addition to listening to the residents, I think the call to all of us is for us to become astute students of history and learn from this history of housing in the United States, which, we cannot move forward and build a better collective future without us coming to terms with what happened in the past.
Thank you.
I can go next to pick up on the history thread. And I'm super excited to be here, and I really appreciate the conference making space for Tom and for Tom's remembrance. It felt really nice to share the space with him for a little bit. So to me, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is that housing is very much a labor issue, and that labor is a housing issue. And I've been spending time in a police archive in the New York State Museum, which has been really strange. But one of the things that has come up in this archive that kept track of radicals, anarchists, communists, and socialists in at the turn of the century in New York State and going into the 20s was that the biggest rent strikes, the biggest organizing moments that focused on housing during that time really came out of the labor movement and were often led by teenage girls who are 14, 15 years old, working in sweatshops and really coming out of a Yiddishist radical tradition. And it's been very interesting to kind of connect with those histories. So, and we're seeing a little bit of this now, where in Chicago, the teachers union there put rent control into their list of demands, which is amazing, and getting rid of the preemption clause that the state of Illinois has for rent control, and making the connection between the fact that teachers aren't able to find housing in Chicago and that evictions and housing issues affect their students as well, and connecting with the students. And we're also seeing the same demands come up in organizing efforts among grad students in California. We're thinking about housing and the fact that if you're making an adjunct wage, there's absolutely no way in hell you're going to be able to afford to live in most places where colleges are in California, like LA or San Francisco. Yeah, and at the same, so that's kind of movement demands and making those connections, but at the same time also thinking about the fact that the people who are doing the work, doing organizing work, or the technical assistance and support world of the nonprofit industrial complex, which we could talk about and think about what that means within a movement framework, but at the same time, that's the structure that we have, and the people who are doing the supportive work, like movement lawyers and nonprofit workers, really thinking of themselves as workers and not thinking of themselves as I'm going to be working 70 hours a week for a wage that I can't afford. So yeah, that's kind of been the place where my head has been at over the past couple of months.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tela Troge. I'm a member of the Shinnecock Nation. And one of the most empowering things that we can do to build the economic and housing futures is to amplify the voices of those who are most affected. In my case, I come from the Shinnecock territory. We have about 800 acres of land left. That's of an ancestral territory that spanned what's now most of the east end of Long Island. When you go to the edge of our territory, which now is a peninsula surrounded by water, you overlook some of the homes of billionaires and some of the most powerful and influential people in the world. It's not uncommon to look over the water and see a home that just hit the market for $175 million. But when you turn back and look the other way, you see homes that are exposed to the elements. Every single home, we have 253 homes on our territory, is infested with black mold, which was very problematic when we all had to stay inside during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have elders who are experiencing homelessness on their own ancestral lands. We have been cut out of accessing capital for housing for the past 400 years since colonization. And so a couple years ago, I organized a direct action. It was 28 days long, where we had folks come from all over to sleep in tents outside in November during Native American History Month to protest economic warfare that is inflicted on my nation by the state of New York, in order to raise awareness and educate people about what is happening, because a lot of people don't know, and that's crucial, educating. And you can't blame people for not knowing, because systematically, that there's a reason for that. And so that protest was very effective in raising awareness, to the point that we had donors come in and help us preserve some of our ancestral land that has been stolen from us. And I don't have much time to get into it, but there's a book, I saw it walking in on one of the tables. It's called The Land Claim by Tamashi Jackson. Myself, as well as our Shinnecock Nation council member, Kelly Dennis, she's featured on the cover actually. We tell our story in that book. And so due to that direct action, we had an anonymous donor give us over $25 million. Just to give you an idea, the land surrounding our territory, the land that has been stolen from us, goes for about $1 million an acre. And so with the $25 million, we were able to preserve about 25 acres of land that millionaires had built mansions on top of our ancestral burial grounds. But we were able to demolish the mansions, and so that was really, it was incredible. So when we're talking about housing futures and housing justice, it's not just about affordable housing. Seeing that mansion being torn down was conflicting, right? Because I come from a place where we have intergenerational housing. We have 2, 3, 4 generations living in conditions that no human should be living in. At the same time, we're tearing down mansions that could be used for housing, but shouldn't be, because you shouldn't be building a home on a 10,000-year-old burial ground. And so it's not easy. There's no easy solution, but educating and coming together and figuring out what the problem is, and then implementing a plan and working towards equality and justice it's a really powerful, it's a really beautiful thing. And we can achieve housing dignity for everyone that now calls this place home. And I'm very excited to be on this panel and to continue this conversation.
Can I say real quick, this is why we see such an intentional movement for erasure of history. After listening to what you've conveyed to all of us, there are people, there are systems that don't want this kind of history told. So we need to pay attention to the voices, to the people that are advocating that books be removed from schools and that histories literally be eradicated.
I agree. I don't have much to add based on what everyone has already said. I think it's so many different connections that come into housing and housing justice, whether it's labor, whether it's history, memory, organizing. All of these things are really critically important. A lot of the work that I do looks at the politics of all of this work in particular. My usual stance is that we need more renters in elected office. We need more people who have actually experienced what it means to look for a house in this housing market, who have experienced some of the issues of dispossession, of foreclosure, of displacement. They are the ones who should be making the laws around housing. And I think that becomes more difficult, obviously, mounting campaigns. I've been carefully watching the Chicago mayoral campaign, and it's just impossible to run for office and not have access to millions of dollars, and thinking about how developers continue to fund and shape a lot of the major elected office campaigns in our country, and what impact that has on local laws and legislation and codes. So that's always been my plea, is to get more renters in office. And I believe that tenant associations, particularly the ones in public housing, used to really serve as a nice platform for that. There was a very clear path from running a tenant association, being a tenant organizer, running for office, and the loss of tenant associations and public housing developments more generally have really kind of pulled back the ability for people to do that. When people are displaced, when people are evicted, when they're foreclosed upon, it's a very personal issue. It's a very shameful issue, but it's an issue that a lot of people experience. And the refusal to not just acknowledge history, but even acknowledge our present conditions and the constraints that we have. Most people are 1 or 2 paychecks from crisis, and I think that needs to be stated more openly, so that we can push for housing as a human right. There's no reason for people to legitimately spend 60 to 70% of their wages just to live. Food's going up, utilities are going up, we're in this climate crisis. People need housing, they need stability. They need connection to community, they need connection to land. And these are things that are not being shared and openly discussed when people are running for office and when they're making laws. There is an obsession with home ownership in this country, which is wonderful. However, it really forecloses the possibility about thinking about other housing typologies with any sort of real legitimacy. So we don't see SROs, we don't see co-housing, we don't see multi-generational housing. We see ADUs that go to wealthy Californians to build little cute houses in their backyard, which is great, but it doesn't address the crisis. There is increasing experiences with houselessness in this country as part of the housing search, which is very kind of disturbing to me, that people kind of expect to be without housing as they are looking for homes as a result of prior evictions, of credit, of inability to show that they make 30% of, or that their rent's only going to be 30% of their wages. And so, and there's no solutions except to subsidize developers more. In this country, we value the developer more than the renter. So we will do anything to subsidize their stack, make their pro forma make sense, but we don't do that for renters, we don't do that for people. And so they get to dominate a lot of the legislative conversations, they get to dominate a lot of the elected campaigns, and they get to push this continued obsession with homeownership as the goal. So I'm gonna end there.
Thank you. Laura?
I guess I'd also say that, in this kind of question, I like to sit back and listen to organizers and listen to tenants and listen to residents. And that's the first and most important thing after this conversation. And I'd say that if I do have something to offer, it's to help understand some of the systems of abstraction and alienation and dispossession, and to help identify targets. And one good example for me is the evictions data that comes out of the judicial system and then is moved into these private economic systems. And it takes all of these systems of displacement and dispossession and is kind of this magic tool for taking all of that and converting it, transmuting it into individualized blame, where that goes on to somebody's credit record and they're to blame for every single problem that all of these systems are generating. And just understanding what credit records are doing, and then thinking about how we can repurpose them to point that blame back at the landlord, back at the county court system, back at the developers. That's something that people who work with data or who spend their time really thinking about financial systems can offer to organizers. but I never want to substitute some kind of technical expertise for the hard work of building a community who knows their own truth and who's expressing it and speaking truth to power, because that technical expertise is just not it.
I agree. Yeah, and I also really, sort of, just from listening to everybody here, you can see how housing is not just a housing issue, right? Like, this is an issue which is about public safety in prisons and sort of linking with the abolition movement. This is an issue like where we're talking about nothing about us without us and thinking about the disability rights movement. It's about insisting this vision of a single family home is not necessarily what we are all our freedom dreams are. And so it's about a gay, lesbian, trans, sort of reimagining what family is and how we live issue and the histories of displacement. I mean, it's Indigenous rights, a land back movement. It's us reimagining our relationship to the land. And so we have to open up the conversation about housing as a human right to be inclusive of all of these movements. And one little tweak to what I went to a conference once with the great Miriam, and it was about prisons. And somebody was sort of saying how important it is to listen to people who have been incarcerated with lived experience. And of course, we want to foreground that. But Miriam also was like, just because you went to prison doesn't necessarily mean you have an analysis of prison. And there's also a space at the table for people who have different kinds of experiences. One, acknowledging that we're all impacted by housing insecurity because we're living in society and we're with people in solidarity, but that, that every single sort of scholar, activist, thinking person has something to offer to this struggle, and how important it is for us to be building those connections, recognizing that there are organic intellectuals, that there's knowledge outside of the academy, but that also the academy has a critical role in sort of linking scholars with activists and advocates in order for us to work together to understand these complicated histories that aren't so complicated that we can't solve them. These are human problems. That means that there are human solutions.
Thank you, Lisa. I have other questions, but I also know that in the interest of time, I want to give everyone in the audience an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. So where did Miriam go? I'm not sure if there are mics available for folks in the audience to ask questions. Yes? Okay, so we have mics going around. If you have questions, please raise your hand and they will come around. I don't see them, but I trust that they're there somewhere. But one of the things I think, Lisa, to your point, that I wanted to sort of bring out are what are some of the ways that we can make these connections between what's happening on the ground and what's happening in institutions like this, and making sort of the research that's being done, taking the eviction data that Elora mentioned, how can we make that more accessible to the folks how can we build connections and bridges to what's happening on the ground between the folks who are doing the sort of analytic work and moving that forward to achieve broader goals across these different areas that you've mentioned?
I've been in the arena of housing and insecurity in some form or fashion or another for the past 15 years, and the more that I do this work, the more intersectional I see that it is, and it touches every broken system in our society. And I'm trying to get persons in positions to make decisions in the city of Nashville to see how the tentacles of housing insecurity touches everything. And we can't look at it as, oh, you're housing insecure because you made a bad decision along the way and put you in this position. No, there are so many things that are in place that were designed to create the madness around homelessness and housing insecurity that we see today. And I want people to look at it in a much more broader manner than what they do. We need to see capitalism and the role that it has played. It has been meant to do the level of harm that we see, and it will continue to do harm if we don't arrest it in some form or fashion. This was the role of capitalism, to do the harm that we see in communities, especially communities of color. So we've got to be very intentional about looking at the big picture and asking ourselves some really hard questions about the kind of world that we want to live in. So that's my little soapbox.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Nan. I am a undergrad student, non-traditional, from the state of New Hampshire. I traveled here with my teen to be here today. I guess what I have to say is more of a comment that I'd love a response to than it is a question. I agree wholeheartedly that we need more voices at the table belonging to people with the lived experience, the people living in public housing, experiencing poverty, who come from identities and backgrounds that are overlapping issues. The barrier that needs to be removed is the lack of pay or means provided to make it possible. State reps get paid very little money, and the schedule for when they hold legislation hearings conflicts with working people's schedules. And I think that something that also needs to happen is removing those barriers to make it possible for poor people and marginalized folks to have a seat at the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Oh.
Hello? Okay, hello. My name is Aisha Balagan. I'm a Master's of Urban Planning student at NYU Wagner. I have a question that is for anybody who has a thought, but it's in direct response to something Oksana brought up. I'm really interested in the idea of housing justice as a labor justice issue. And I was wondering if you could talk more about what that means in terms of how the two movements share resources. For example, like when we talk about housing as a health issue, sometimes we talk about like how nonprofit hospitals could do more to further affordable housing in their communities. I guess, do you see like a similar way that the two movements of labor and housing can share resources to kind of collectively advance both their goals?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I can start, and I'm sure that other people on the panel have thoughts about this as well. At like a very base level, there are lots of unions in New York State that very actively work against tenant issues and housing issues. And it's because of for a ton of different reasons, the kind of like the destruction of radical unions in first the 20s, then the 50s, then the 80s, and the kind of like entrenched conservatism of certain types of unions that are kind of almost rooted within the real estate industry, and I'm specifically thinking about some trade unions, not all by any means, and I'm very much talking about the leadership of specific trade unions where like the rank and file doesn't necessarily agree, or some do, some don't. So yeah, I think that like at the minimum, not having labor unions oppose tenant reforms that tenants are organizing for on the state level would be the beginning. And then like if thinking about more broadly, like thinking about true solidarity between labor organizers and tenant organizers working towards the same goals. Yeah, and I could stop there and let other people say stuff.
I just say that in Atlanta, I think a lot about our voting organizations because we have really strong organizations around getting out the vote that go back decades. We don't have a strong history of union organizing, but we've started to see more bridges made between people who are concerned about the franchise and people understanding that's very much connected to what's happening with housing and building bridges between those organizations. So I guess different cities have different histories, and we don't have that union history necessarily that other cities do. So we are still, all these issues are interconnected, and thinking about ways to build bridges between them and learn from people who have been working in this city organizing around, a different but related issue is really important.
Yeah, I think the interconnectedness is really key here. All of the issues that we're facing as a society combined, and they're all related, and they all have their elements, and just what are the foundational, human rights here. And so a lot of the work that I do is with the climate crisis. And in the 1970s, when the United States failed to stand up for my tribe, we saw a vast overdevelopment of residential homes, which completely destroyed our ecosystem, which we had used the water particularly to sustain ourselves for subsistence and sustenance. And it created a situation where the houses were built with no planning, no septic systems, no municipal wastewater treatment. It's an area called the Shinnecock Hills. It's the highest point of the watershed. It's all of this extreme amounts of nitrates and the carbon from the greenhouse gases has killed everything in the water. And so, every time we demolish one of these mansions and we're just taking out 26 bathrooms, like we're doing a little bit, but the work that I do in the water, it's I grow sugar kelp. It extracts nitrates from the water and it sequesters carbon, and it allows for marine habitat, which in turn allows for human habitation of the area. And so and while we're doing it, we make sure that we pay our people to do these type of green jobs a living wage, because historically our people have been denied employment. And so it's all interconnected, and it's all so that people can live where they want to live, and their families can do the things that they love to do and enjoy nature the way that we should. And so my point being that it's all interconnected, and it's, as we plan housing, we have to do it in a way that's respectful to the environment. And the key to doing that is again rooted in equality and Indigenous stewardship. And the people who call this place home first can lead the way in doing this in a sustainable manner.
I also want to just sort of call out sort of a lot of right to the city movements who bring attention to the fact that the people who can afford to live in cities are different than the people who actually make the city run, right? The people who are providing the care and the service industries, cleaning the homes, cooking the food, preparing the food, changing the lights, sweeping the streets. And so we are becoming more and more like ring cities in Europe and other places where people who are the vibrancy of the culture and the life and the labor can't afford to live in these cities, right? Which then also makes housing a transportation issue and a lot of these other things. And so I think there's so many connections that we can't, ignore if we're talking about housing as a human right.
Hi, Kelly Dennis, Tela's cousin, Shinnecock elected tribal leader, councilwoman for Council of Trustees. Yes, and I was, that transportation issue too, like especially getting on the Hamptons out on Long Island, like we are the Shinnecock tribe, we put the railroad through, sadly enough, through our own territory. We built the golf course that has, our ancestors' remains there just so we could survive. And it's caused so much intergenerational trauma. Like when they say, there's actual quotes from the founders of that golf course, like, you never knew if you were gonna, play in the sand trap and hit the ball out, if you were gonna hit a bone, a skull, or alcohol flask out. because the Indians drank so much when they, that's how they basically paid us in alcohol. So with that, I bring in the mental health component and how at Shinnecock, what we've tried to do with some of our COVID-19 Build Back Better funding for the federal government and CARES Act funding, ARPA funding, is, and also help with FEMA, build at least 3 homeless housing units. And, you know, there's part of that is that, you know, you have to agree to work with a social worker and, you know, get those resources that you need, whether you have a substance abuse problem, a mental health kind of thing that you need to go see a therapist for, and see what kind of, you know, assistance that you can get to, you know, be able to try to stand up on your own, you know, maybe try to mend the relationships with your family so you can live with them. And because, you know, we do still support intergenerational living if it's sustainable, but sometimes it's not in the kind of homes that we have and that aren't to code and so on and so on. So yeah, it's, you know, it's just something that I've struggled. I think in my first month of being an elected leader, I broke down to my parents because I was like, this is so hard, like trying to get in, like trying to help my fellow tribe members, my family members who, without being in that position, I would never know how they actually live. And now Tela, you know, she's an attorney, we're both attorneys, and now she's also you know, she took on this family services program, like job to try to get these, you know, services going, and now, you know, she's graciously taking on this head of a new department that we right now call the Health and Community Services Department to, you know, see that we can keep people's lights on when PSCG bills are going out of control and people have the oil they need for their homes, and maybe we can get some solar panels in. And I just want to, not only do I want to thank Tela so much for all the work she does, but I want to thank her partner in life, Matt Ballard, for all the wonderful work that he does to get her to where she needs to be, and for helping her to create the most beautiful baby, who is my godson, Benjamin Robin Ballard.
Yeah, and just to bring home your question, what can institutions like this do? Institutions like this can return the remains of our ancestors. That will greatly impact our mental health and our stresses and our anxieties that we feel. A lot of institutions in the city do hold those human remains. And also the research. You know, I'm an attorney, I'm a mother, I'm not a scientist. I need that data in order to write grants that allow me to pay a living wage or find the solutions to the problems that I identify in the community. And it wouldn't be possible without a partnership that comes full circle with academic institutions.
Thank you. Yep.
Hey, I'm Jonathan. I'm a grad student at Parsons. Thank you all so much for being here and for sitting on this panel. I was really interested in something Akira said about the obsession with ownership in our society. We all know that ownership is an ideology that is formed from the tax code to like cultural products like TV shows on HGTV. And I've been really struck when I'm looking at alternative forms of tenure, like CLTs, for community land trusts, for example. Like when people talk about them, they're like, it's public housing. Oh no, it's actually affordable home ownership. To like make it more palatable or something. And obviously home ownership has a deep rootedness in the civil rights movement and Black liberation and generational wealth. And so I guess my question is, like, can ownership be salvaged for the housing movement, or does it need to be entirely reimagined? Yeah.
Cool. I love big questions like this. They're my favorite. Yeah, okay. So, and this also kind of relates to the comment the first person made about like breaking down those barriers and making it more accessible. or that you don't have to, even if you've been to prison, you don't necessarily have an analysis of prison. And I found that in my research with tenant organizers that they were very much interested in home ownership. They were not totally committed to keeping public housing public and keeping it affordable and for everyone because it had been such a disaster, honestly. And I think that's the difficulty, is that the resources we have obviously go towards home ownership and propping up home ownership as an ideology, as a transfer of wealth, everything that you mentioned. And for people who have been denied opportunities for home ownership for so long, they should be able to benefit from that. But the actual process and the actual ideology and the wealth transfers are quite harmful. They are wasteful. They clearly are rooted in our kind of like racist, patriarchal system that don't allow people who have been disenfranchised in the past to benefit from them ever truly. And I think that that is a difficult, that's a, I don't know, difficult nut to crack? I don't know. But it's something where it's hard to, again, if we're going to value and listen to the voices of people who are living this actual struggle, it's hard to kind of argue with them about why they should buy into the idea of a community land trust, why home ownership is not, you know, the wonderful white picket fence that you see on TV and HGTV. And so I do believe in a diversity of tenures. I do think land trusts are the way to go. But I think there are a host of tools, and I think it's kind of our government's refusal to diversify its tools and subsidies that make it really difficult. Why would you want to live in public housing if they're actively trying to destroy it? Why wouldn't you want to live in a single family home, even if it's 20 miles from your community and your job and everything, if they're going to pay your closing costs and no down payment and everything else that they give you? They don't give that for renters at all. And so it's just a really difficult, both, like you said, ideological and kind of material battle to overcome. But I do think raising awareness, venues and events like this are really helpful. And just the actual reality, home ownership, building new housing everywhere, every day is just not sustainable in this new world that we're living in. So hopefully over time and with a greater diversity of voices at the table, we can overcome some of that. But in the meantime, I think it's probably one of the biggest struggles in the housing justice movement. And it's obviously very place dependent. It's not the biggest conversation in New York versus Cincinnati.
I also think that this is where like artists can really play a role, because we really have to unleash, you know, sort of our freedom dreams and our radical imaginations, because we need to recognize that the idea of owning a single family home is a manufactured desire, and relatively recently too, right? Like when you look at the huge amount of money that the real estate agency, let's just name them as, you know, as one of these kinds of corporations that has really pushed this dream, you see these ads where they have like, a real man owns a home, right? Like this kind of gendered sensibility of like what home ownership means. And these were really manufactured desires of like basically the early 20th century in sort of capitalism in the United States. And like these things have to be unpacked, and we can learn so much from Indigenous people and with their relationship to the land, and be like, yeah, you don't need to own land, right? We inhabit land. And there's other ways of thinking about cooperative living that even in the United States, the turn of the century, like settlement houses and women coming together and saying, oh, we could live cooperatively. Why would you want to have your own kitchen that you would have to clean by yourself? This was General Electric manufacturing desire for ovens and refrigerators for everyone, right? So these things are so recent, and like we have the intelligence and the sort of collective ability to reimagine how we live, and you know, I deeply believe that. And the role of artists in helping us do that, I just want to say, is very much out there. We have a program at the National Public Housing Museum called Artists as Instigator, which is bringing artists to try to think of different ways of telling these stories and making history more public. Yeah.
You have another question?
Hi, my name's Caitlin Penner. I'm a master's student at Hunter College. And I have kind of a follow-up question about home ownership and the way that financialization and kind of speculation and speculative financial markets have kind of, especially in the post-2008 state, made all of this so much riskier. And I guess kind of when we're thinking about alternative tenures like co-ops and community land trusts, how all of you think that there are ways where we can avoid, kind of close up the holes to prevent those markets that have caused so much harm from entering these spaces, because the unfortunate reality that we live in is that it does take money to operate housing, and how we can kind of use public money, public resources, financialized resources to make these alternate forms of tenure truly kind of for the social good.
So I have some thoughts about that. So first, I'd say about homeownership that the production of value through homeownership and the reconstruction of people's relationship to land and home is really pernicious and is predicated on racial divides. And for me, the best example of this is thinking about the first redlining maps. They weren't done to keep people from buying homes. They weren't done to ration mortgages, but they actually shifted how lenders valued homes from the individual's credit history, because they're actually finding that people of color had really good payment records, and they shifted it to this collateral value which took in the characteristics of the neighborhood in a very racialized way. And so that shift to valuing land based on collateral risk rather than credit risk was how we injected race back into property markets at a time when the civil rights movement was starting to gain steam, right? So, it's really hard to separate homeownership from those deep logics. And it's really hard to practice ownership. It's hard for me to rescue it, right? The issue that I see is that collateral logic extends to social housing because we have secondary financial markets attached to public housing, community land trusts. And this really became apparent to me when I saw the Asian Development Bank creating mortgages for customary land in Samoa, which cannot be bought or sold. And they said, we're not gonna do what John Locke recommended. We're not gonna do fee simple, individual types of ownership. We're not gonna change your land tenure, but we're gonna create secondary financial markets and we can buy and sell interest in this land. And it had the same effect. And it resulted in a huge political crisis in what is normally a very stable country. So I believe in social housing, but sometimes we're not noticing these secondary financial markets and how important they are in creating the same conditions, the same abstraction, the same alienation, while appearing to be communal.
One of the reasons why the housing conditions where I'm from are so bad is because every tribal member collectively and communally owns the land. And together with that, there's a restriction against alienation, which means that we can't access capital through traditional financing. We can't get a mortgage. We can't get a home equity loan because of the communal status of the land. Kelly and I are actually traveling back from DC because we had to work with a federal agency to get a designation of our land from urban to rural, just so that we could access USDA funding, which would allow us to access capital for the first time since 1640. So even what seems like a solution, even that has been used against us, and I think that's really important to be cognizant of, and to learn from the pitfalls, that have been experienced through that. And so one of the ways that we're envisioning a better future is being able to leverage this new designation that we received from the USDA in order to access something called HUD 184 loans, which allow Indigenous people to access that capital that has been historically denied for us. And so we're just at a really incredible juncture. And also noteworthy, I recently started a land trust and had probably the world's hardest time in getting New York State finance to allow me to use the word trust. And every other land trust in New York State could use that word, but apparently not an Indigenous land trust. But I had a big yet but small win yesterday when it was approved that I could use the word Nyamak Land Trust.
Thank you so much.
I think the thing that we keep on coming back to is that, again, housing just doesn't exist in a vacuum. And when we're thinking about what a home is and how to limit the role of financial capitalism, I think that what the last question was really trying to get at in these spheres is that we have to think about the financial markets, in addition to thinking about the forms of tenure that we're really interested in, whether it's community land trusts or public housing, where all of these forms are so embattled because, like the last speaker said, where they have to contend with the fact that we're living in a very neoliberalized financial market.
So I think that we have to actually start to wrap up. I want to thank the panelists. Thank you all for your questions. We'll continue these conversations this afternoon.